Come on in. I'm going to talk for a long time. You don't want to stand up. Hi, my name is Ginger Grilli, and I'm the Education Manager at Salem Historical Society. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I know you're all anxious to find out about the Underground Railroad. So today I'm going to share information on Salem's role in the Underground Railroad. Let's start with some history. I'll take you back to 1850. In 1850, the states were pretty evenly divided in their opinions about slavery. The northern states opposed, the southern states in favor. So abolition is the abolition of slavery. Abolitionists are people who supported abolishing slavery. Ohio was always a free state. There were never slaves permitted there. So you can see we're listed in green. Obviously, in the states where the red and the green met, there were skirmishes along the borders. You frequently had family members pitted against each other. Ohio, West Virginia, today Virginia, and Kentucky was an area where skirmishes frequently occurred. So southern Columbiana County had a mix of butternuts being Midwesterners who favored slavery, and abolitionists who were opposed. How did you get to become a slave? So, do you think anybody volunteered to be a slave? That's a yes or no question. No. Okay. No one volunteered to be a slave. So you were captured in one of two ways. African tribes warred with each other. Very common in this time frame. Their countries and kingdoms were being set up. And one African tribe would capture members from the other tribe that they were fighting against and sell them off. Easier than feeding them and taking care of them, and also made money for their treasury to fund more wars. They were taken to port cities where they were put on purchased by slave traders and brought to other countries, United States, Caribbean, and Europe. So you got caught in a war. Prisoners of war were made slaves. And what if there weren't enough prisoners of war? Well, the demand for slaves was still there, so they kidnapped you. One tribe would kidnap people from another tribe and sell them into slavery. So the capture of slaves was Africans against Africans. Now, the trading of slaves was both black and white. So slave traders, some were white, some were black. It was a very lucrative profession to trade slaves. You could make a lot of money. You see the ship on the bottom left-hand side? Those little dark spots are people shoved into the hull of the ship. Front to back, back to front, as many as you could possibly fit, because that was the most economical way. Now, you might die along the way. Food, nutrition were not, and sanitation were not real prominent. They didn't really care too much about that. But if you died, you were considered bad stock. So you were treated like livestock, cows, chickens, pigs, horses, cattle. And if you died, it didn't really matter because the ship owner was paid anyway. Insurance covered loss of cargo. Slaves were cargo. So if you died, I got money for you. If you made it to the end and I auctioned you off, which you'll see in a sec, I made money from you. So I made money regardless. So I really didn't care how many of you I stuffed onto that ship. And the other picture is just people on deck during the day. And you can see, not a good place to be. So where were you sold? Well, you were sold at slave markets across the South. Now, at the time, Wheeling, which is today West Virginia, very close to us, was part of the state of Virginia. There was no West Virginia yet. That happened during the Civil War time. So there was a slave market at Wheeling. So that was the closest place someone could buy slaves. Slaves sold at Wheeling were not generally brought to Ohio unless they were purchased by abolitionists whose intention was to set them free. So one way for a slave to get free was to be bought and then released. A slave could also buy their own freedom if they were able to save money through whatever means, or had a bequest of some type, sometimes from a previous owner who would leave them money. So you could buy your freedom, someone else could buy it for you, or you could escape. But that was really the only ways that you could be free if you had become a slave. So how much did you get? Well, you got between $400 and $1,000 on average for a slave that was auctioned off. Now, what does that mean in today's money? How much do you think a family earned in that time frame? What was an annual household income for a family? Let me take a guess. Then I'll go up and down.
2,000.
Okay, 200. Good guess. Just probably a little bit more. 250 to 350 a year. So that would be an average household wage. So the cost of a slave, regardless of their age or condition, was about an annual household income, up to 3 times an annual household income. So slaves were a very significant investment, but you had a lifetime of service from them. And so it was the slave owners considered it a good investment. Most slaves were branded, and you put the hot iron in the fire and you would put a mark on them, just like you would a horse or a cow, so that if they escaped, you could identify them and have them brought back. Initially, making it to the north was enough, and you may have heard things like, well, if they escaped to the northern states, they were free. But that was only until 1850. In 1850, they passed the Second Fugitive Slave Act. That made it legal for property owners to recapture their property. And slaves were property. So the slave owners could send slave catchers, the olden day Dog the Bounty Hunter, to the north to find their slaves, or to the south if they were still in the south, and to capture them and return them. The penalty for harboring runaway slaves could be up to $5,000. Now, that's like 15 years household income. 15 years. You could have all your property taken away. You could be imprisoned. So the abolitionists of the time definitely put their lives and their property at risk by helping the slaves to escape. Slaves were considered property, so it was theft, and it was a felony because it was major theft if you helped a slave to escape. But again, abolitionists could purchase slaves and set them free. How did you ensure that the slaves were going to listen? Well, families were separated. There weren't family units kept together, so when you were sold, a mother, a child, a spouse might be sold to a different property owner. They would make them wear collars, like the dog collars with the prongs, and when they got tired and their heads started to droop, the prong would poke them, and they would not be able to take a rest. They wore leg irons. Now, you've seen leg irons in movies, I'm sure, and sometimes on chain gangs today working on highway projects and things. Leg irons are very heavy, they're uncomfortable. We actually have a pair at the museum, but they would impede you from running away, because you really can't run very far, very fast if you're wearing leg irons. But it makes your job much more difficult because you're carrying around a whole bunch of extra weight through the day. Corporal punishment or beatings were common. 30 lashes with a whip was considered a minor punishment. So slaves were beaten into submission. They also had training programs where, especially for the domestics, females that were going to be serving in the household, or men who had a little bit more culture, might be enlisted to serve the master of the house, might even work their way up to chief man of the house, who would drive that person's carriage or wagon and spend time in the house instead of with the slaves in the other residences that would be on the property. And those people were, actually, they had schools where they would indoctrinate them and train them on how to behave. Punishment was also a part of those schools if necessary. So corporal punishment, beatings were common. Slave catchers were also a very lucrative profession because they could earn between $100 and $1,000 per slave returned, depending upon their value to the owner. So let's say it was the chief man of the plantation, or a leader in the plantation within the black community of slaves who lived there. To set an example, that person would have a very high bounty because returning them was important to keep people in line. Also, slave catchers were not very honest at times, and they would catch any black person they could and then make attempt to return them. So you'll also hear stories of free blacks in the North being captured and put into slavery even though they were already freed. There's several roles on the Underground Railroad. You had agents, those are people who planned escape routes. Now, the interesting thing about the Underground Railroad, it was neither underground nor railroad. Underground means secret. It meant that the folks would communicate. The people who were working on the Underground Railroad would speak to each other in codes and messages and symbols so that other people who were not part of that network would not know. And the railroad refers to a network of transportation. And they compared it to a railroad because it was what they knew at the time. Railroads were the most efficient way to get from one place to another. But people traveled on foot, by wagon, they traveled in boats, sometimes they did travel on the railroad, frequently stilled away in a baggage component car where they would jump off or be broken off at a station by some of the abolitionists. And that happened a lot in Salem. Brakemen are people who put on the brakes, because there was danger ahead. So they would communicate with the escaping slaves that were on that planned route, because the abolitionists knew where they were going, that they couldn't continue on that same route. They were going to have to make a change, because there was some reason for it. And bypasses are those changes in routes. Conductors are people who actually took folks along the route part of the way, never all of the way, because the conductors worked in a geographic area and then would hand them off to another group of people in another geographic area. Slaves were never called slaves because that would allow a non-abolitionist to identify that you were involved in that activity. And again, that put you and those escaping slaves at risk. So they were called things: baggage, loaded potatoes, cargo. And let's say I'm talking to you, you're a fellow abolitionist, and I use a certain type of language, and you know what I'm saying. And I'm telling you, I have someone, we need your help for them to escape. And depending upon which activity you're involved with, we might meet or make plans to do that. So you might come to my home, we might meet at another location that was identified as a meeting place, and we would make that plan and help them get out. People would stay in an area for a while, and frequently they stayed at stations. Stations are locations, often houses, but they could be a field, they could be anything that was identifiable and commonly known to the abolitionists. Salem has a lot of stations. There are over 30 documented Underground Railroad sites in Salem. There's other reports, but again, we're historians, so we can't tell you that those are confirmed yet, but I'm sure there were more. I just can't tell you how many. Station masters were people who were in charge of that site. And obviously, if the station was someone's home, the homeowner was the person who did that. Stockholders funded activities. They gave money towards the cause, didn't necessarily use their own time and resources to do that, but did give money. Telegraphs were messages, and you could see, you might say, receipt of packages. That meant that the folks got there safely. Other things that were signs and symbols that were used that were part of that secret communication were lanterns. Lit lanterns was a go. Lanterns with no light, it's a no-go. Same thing with jockey statues. Now today, jockey statues, we would think that was socially inappropriate. But the abolitionists actually used those statues to communicate whether or not you could proceed. Red lantern meant went stop, just like a stoplight. Green lanterns meant it was fine to proceed along the route that you had been given. They had tokens where they could identify themselves to each other. Quilt patterns. I saw a picture in the back, and you were talking about the quilters. Quilts were a way to communicate messages. There's actually several books written about that. There's one called The Language of Quilts. And there was a woman on one of the plantations in the South. She never escaped. She stayed on the plantation till she died. But what she did, as different people would travel further out, because what they would do is they travel out further from the plantation, the sleeping and working area, to try to identify what lay beyond. And then they would come back and they would report. And the hope was to gather enough information that they'd be able to escape at some point. So as those folks came back with the information, she would sew that into a huge quilt, which was hanging on the wall and ended up becoming an actual map of the plantation and the areas that lay beyond. And again, as I said, she never escaped, but she helped many of the other slaves on that plantation to escape because they could follow her map to get away. At Salem, we have a quilt in our collection, and it's called the Drunkard's Pattern. If you're not familiar with that, it has no straight lines in it. The Africans believed evil traveled in a straight line, so a quilt with no straight lines would mean this was a safe place. If you hung that quilt over again, no washing machine, so you clean things by airing them out. You hang it over your wash line or out your window, over the porch railing. And if you were an escaping slave and you saw that drunkard's quilt pattern laying out in front of a house, you knew that that was a safe house. Some patterns that you may be familiar with are bow tie. Bow tie meant wear your best clothes, go to town, and we'll locate you. The log cabin pattern meant you're close to the end of your journey. So different quilt patterns had different meanings on the Underground Railroad. There were songs. There's a song that's taught in some of the grade schools in Ohio. It's called the Dipper Gourd, and it teaches you how to find the North Star. So it was illegal to teach a slave to read or write. So things like songs and stories, like they told Bible stories. They could not read them because, again, very, very few slaves knew how to read or write. That was another illegal activity that some of the people assisting them participated in. But they would tell stories, and those Bible stories would communicate things, and the songs would communicate things. And the Dipping Gourd song teaches them how to go 5 lengths of the spoon of the Big Dipper, which is easy to find in the night sky, and follow that along the handle, and it will point you to the North Star. On the Little Dipper, which is hard to find. And we actually have that on the ceiling of one of our buildings at the museum, because we did use the song and teach the students how to look up into the night sky to find the North Star. And finding the North Star meant that at night you could travel north, which was the only thing people knew how to do, just keep going north, and eventually you will run into Canada. And then after 1850, when they passed that law, then it was safe, you're out of the country. In Salem, we used pry bars, and I don't mean like the little kind you get at Home Depot to take tacks out of the floor. I'm talking big pry bars, industrial type that you might have on a farm or in a factory. And if you came home and you found a pry bar stuck in the ground, which wouldn't look like much to anyone else, it was a symbol that there was a meeting and that you had to get together with your fellow abolitionists and you were going to be breaking someone off of the train. And that was and then you would get a coded message from other abolitionists, sometimes sent like mail, just like you'd send a message today, and it would have a code that told you what day, what time, what car, and how many people were on that car, and you would break them off. So it was like spy code messages, but they were used as part of the Underground Railroad. Bird calls, whistles, knocking patterns, all of those things that you see in movies and you think, oh well, they were all utilized by the abolitionists. Now on our tour that we do a trolley tour where you can actually see many of the homes in Salem that are part of that documented Underground Railroad site. Most of them are wealthier citizens. Only reason is that their homes were built a little better. Most of the people who weren't quite as wealthy, their homes were built of wood, and many of them have not lasted over time. We've just recently lost a few to the land bank acquisition programs, where they're trying to eliminate blight in cities. And they've decided that it's not worth it to fix old houses, and so they want to tear them down instead. So, obviously as a historian, not my choice, but it is something that happens, and we are at risk to lose some of those other houses. But I'll show you a couple of the houses, and these are places that you would get to see if you were on our trolley. This is the Abraham Webb house, but it's of note because Dr. John Winery and his family lived in the home. Winery was a dentist from Salem. He was a conductor, he was a station master, and he was also a philanthropist. And he funded, we have a slave who escaped through Salem. His name is Strutter Brown. And he lost the trail of the Underground Railroad around Washington, D.C., met a young Union soldier there, and they exchanged confidences, and he said to the soldier, "Can you help me escape? I'm trying to get to Canada." And the soldier said, "I don't know how to get to Canada, but I can tell you how to get to Salem, Ohio. And if you get to Salem, Ohio, the people there will help you to escape," because he was from Salem. So he did. Strutter came to Salem. The people helped him escape. He went to Canada, where he lived through the rest of the war. At the end of the war, he had to decide what he wanted to do. And he decided, you know what? I'm going to go back to America. And I think I'm going to go to Salem because those people there were nice and they helped me. So he rode into town. The only thing he had was a huge hat with a feather in it and a big white stallion. And he rode to Salem on his horse, okay, from Canada. It felt like a distance because it's 6 hours in a car today, so. Took him a while, but he made it back. When he came to town, he looked up the young soldier. And believe it or not, that soldier had survived the war. And he was hung, too. They're both poor as church mice. And he said, you know, I need a job. And the soldier said, you know, we all need a job. He said, I can't help you, but I know someone who can. And the person he sent him to was John Winery, the dentist. And Winery funded his basket making business. Now, he offered to give Strutter Brown money to do that. And Strutter said, oh no, I can't take your money. I'll take a loan. I'll pay you back and make you a basket every year for as long as I live, which he did. He lived to be about 100. We're not really sure how old he was because they didn't keep records of when he was born. But he lived to be about 100 and made baskets every year. He died early 1900s. The black settlers of Salem sold postcards of him at work because he was a local folk hero. Many people knew him and bought his baskets. And they buried him. And his tombstone is a carved obelisk with a basket in it. It's in Hope Cemetery. It's on a lot of our cemetery tours. And you can put money in there, and that's good luck. So kids put change in there all the time. But anyway, this man funded that business. Also, the home is of note because he had 9 children, 7 of whom lived to be adults. And when his daughter Abigail was 7 years old, she was playing in the front yard, and the slave catcher came because there was a report that they were harboring slaves in their home. And the slave catcher wasn't allowed to come alone, so he came with the sheriff, and the sheriff said, the slave catcher talked to the little girl, and he said, hey girl, do you have any slaves in there? And she looked at him and she said, no sir, we do not. And the slave catcher looks at the sheriff and says, well, we're going in, aren't we? Because they had to have law enforcement with them, they could actually go in and search a home. And the sheriff says to him, oh no, they're Quakers, they won't lie to save their own life. So they didn't go in and they left. And after they were gone for a little while, well out of earshot, Winery looks at his daughter and says, daughter, thou knowest we have 3 black men in our attic. And she looked at her father and she said, but father, thou taught me all men are free. There are no slaves. So she didn't lie, but there were 3 black men in the attic. So this is the Winery home. It's at the corner of Pershing and South Lincoln. This is a building some of you may be familiar with. It used to be Sherwin-Williams Paint Store. It is now the Liebe Wine Winery. And I want you to look at this picture and remember the upper levels of the building. Because from the first floor up, the building is exactly the same as it was built in the 1830s. They have changed the first floor to have these windows for commerce. But this is what the home looked like. And the stoop where the people are sitting is actually the Jacob Heaton home. Now, it is known as the Jacob Heaton Tavern, although it was never a bar. Tavern means hospitality to the Quakers. So this is a place of hospitality. And anyone who was famous, who was visiting Salem, would have been at Jacob Heaton's home to take a meal, have a visit. sign. He actually had a book called The Record of Friends, where those folks would sign, kind of like an autographed book or something like you're signing a book today, but you could write messages in there. And he also combined it with objects that he collected. So he had programs from different activities and events where he was. Very interesting person. He was an abolitionist, but also a suffragist, very involved in the early women's rights movement. And that's his family on the stoop of the home there. Just two different versions. And the building that's to the right of the tree, and you think, like, where is that? Well, that's right on State Street in Salem. And there's a tree, and there's lawns, and like people live there. Well, homes and businesses were intermixed with each other. Frequently, people lived on the second floor of the building, and the first floor was their business. Or they lived in a separate home like he did, which was next door to his business. So that 3-story building that's to the right of his home was actually his dry goods business. Now that building's not there anymore. It's been replaced by another brick building. But he was a provisioner. He ran the local merchant store. This is what Salem looked like in the early days, 1806. Now when you think of Ohio, and this would include all of Mahoning County, Columbiana County, all of the area where we are, it was said there were so many trees in Ohio, a squirrel could jump on a tree in Cincinnati and jump branch to branch and make it all the way to Cleveland and never touch the ground. Okay, so that's how many trees we had. And I know that's hard for us to picture today, but Ohio was one big forest. And then around 1800, they finished signing the Indian treaties and they started chopping roads through. And so this was a cabin, probably Bishop's cabin, if I had to guess, because that was the first cabin built in Salem on North Lincoln Avenue, right near where the old junior high school is today, the Kent State City Center. And they dug a well there, built a cabin, and chopped some trees down. And that was that. This is Town Hall. Now, Town Hall was located at the corner of Ellsworth and State Street. I was on the north corner, the northeast corner. It was a huge building. Now, when I say huge, I want you to picture this. Okay, we have in our lobby of one of our buildings, we have the hands of this clock. The hands of that clock are 5 feet tall. Okay, there's tall. The hands of the clock are this big. So you can imagine how massive this building was. It was so big, the first floor had the place for the fire wagons, the police, the jail, and the very small administrative building, because that was before government took over so much space. The second floor was a huge auditorium where people could and had many meetings, including those supporting abolition and suffrage. But they also had entertainment there and bicycle races. It was big enough to bicycle race, which was the most popular sport right before 1900. So everyone in America was crazed with bicycles. And the second floor of this building was our racetrack. So just get you an idea. Now, another thing about that building is Harriet Beecher Stowe spoke there. Now, you might know she wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin. She was instrumental in convincing many people in Salem to take up the cause of abolition. Another important site, which was a block from there, no longer there, but it's at the empty parking area behind a little car repair shop next to Chase Bank at 2nd and North Ellsworth. And this building was the Hicksite Friends Meeting House. Now, do you have any Quakers in the group today? Is anyone here a Quaker? Okay. Give you a little bit more information about Quakers. When I first came here, I thought of Quakers as a religion, and it's not. The word Quakers is more like the word Protestant. You know, if you're a Protestant, you might be a Methodist. So I heard you talk about Lutherans earlier. You could be an Episcopalian. You could be any one of a number of things. If you are there are different denominations. If you are a Quaker, there are many denominations as well. And Salem had 3 denominations. Our first was the Gurney. The second was the Hicksite. This was their meeting house after John Hicksite, who had a couple of different ideas than the Gurneys had initially. And we have a third congregation, the Wilbur Friends. Now, Wilbur is the only meeting house that's still left. And you notice I'm not saying church. We have Quaker churches in Salem, but the Quaker meeting houses were for the original or Orthodox followers of Fox, who started the Society of Friends. So Society of Friends is the actual name for the Quaker religion. Quakers is the nickname. Originally derogatory, tell you about that in a sec. But this was our second congregation of Quakers in Salem. But I have the picture here because in this time frame, in the 1850s and 60s, this was a really important structure. There were not only abolition meetings there, but it's the site of the second the 1850 Women's Convention in Salem. It was the first attempt to change a state constitution to allow women to vote. It happened in Salem in 1850, and 500 men and women from across the state came together at this building and a building next door where they spilled over, because you can imagine 500 people in that building would be a stretch. This is Liberty Hall. It was the carpenter shop of Samuel Reynolds. Reynolds was an average guy, Quaker, abolitionist, just an all-around good guy. Our first center of town was at where Town Hall was, at the corner of Ellsworth and State. And everything in our community was originally Jeffersonian land grants called Congress lands, okay, given in service to the government because they couldn't afford to pay the people, so they gave them land. The 4 farms that met at that corner, one of them was a half a grant, which was 320 acres. The other 3 were 640-acre land grants, which was a full land grant. But those 4 farmers whose property met at the corner of Ellsworth and State each gave 2 acres at that corner to form town. So the city of Salem was originally 8 acres at the corner of Ellsworth and State. If you've been to Salem lately, you know we kept moving east. The second center of town was at Broadway, then it moved to Lincoln, and now it's at the east end where all of the big box stores are. But the center of town went in blocks, north, south, east, and west from that corner. This is a block up. This is close to where the 2nd Street Plaza is today on North Ellsworth. But just imagine buildings side by side all along. Most of them were 1- and 2-story structures. Now, Reynolds Carpenter Shop had his business on the 1st floor and he had storage on the 2nd. When they passed that Fugitive Slave Act, Second Act in 1850, it wasn't safe for the abolitionists to meet in public anymore, so they went in hiding as well. And he said, you can use the 2nd floor of my building for your meetings. And you can meet here. He cleaned out a storage room for them. Now, the building had a trapdoor on the 1st floor where his business was, and you can see the man who lives there today. All of these buildings are private residences or businesses today, so it's not like they're open to the public as museums. But he is in the basement of his building right under the trapdoor. Now they have bricked over the opening to the tunnel that used to be in the basement of that building. So this was actually a 3-story building. It had a basement, 1st floor, 2nd floor. It always had steps coming out of the 2nd floor, which you can see there. And you can see him going through the trapdoor in what would have been his workshop, where he made tables and benches and bookcases and things. But it's called Liberty Hall because so many people came there to preserve the freedoms that we have in America. We have built a replica of this building to what it looked like originally, because it didn't have all these windows and it didn't have the siding. So we have an original building built with 200-year-old wood on our campus at the museum, and we call it Freedom Hall, and you can tour that if you come for a visit. Everyone who was anyone met at that building. Frederick Douglass, some of you may know the name Sojourner Truth. Now, you might not know that Sojourner actually lived in Salem from 1851 to 1853. She worked for the Anti-Slavery Bugle and traveled around making speeches enlisting people to support abolition. She also stayed at this home, which was at the corner of the 3rd and North Ellsworth. It's no longer there. It still exists, but it's been moved. It's on Pigeon Road right now. And it was the home of John and Angelina Deming. And you may know the name Deming because the Deming Pump Company was very big in Salem. But all of the Demings from the early ages were abolitionists. The Demings, their children, their in-laws, they were all abolitionists. John and Angelina were stockholders. They funded the movement, gave money. Sojourner Truth actually used their wagon when she was in town. That's how she would get around because she didn't have a horse or a wagon. Also, Angelina's parents, Benjamin and Mr. and Mrs. Benjamin Brown, were abolitionists, and they did do some journaling after the Civil War. And they have pretty good records that they helped 300 slaves to escape. One time hiding one of them in plain sight for 2 weeks by dressing her up as a Quaker woman. And she just traveled around town with them. Obviously she's a little lighter skinned, but they were able to hide her until she could get them to safety. You know, we didn't know, they didn't always stay in the same spot for the same amount of time. They might stay overnight, they might stay for a few days, they might have to stay for several weeks until it was safe to go. This is the home of John Street on Ellsworth Avenue, 600 block of Ellsworth. Now, Street was the third oldest son of one of the town founders. And I always say town founders with a little bit of trepidation. Between 1800 and 1801, most of the land grants were made in Salem from Jefferson. So most of those full and partial land grants were made. By 1806, which is the date that Salem gets credited with founding, there were already 200 white settlers, permanent white settlers in Salem. They had dug wells, built buildings, children had been born, people had come and gone already and been replaced by other people. So it was a pretty thriving town, the largest town between Pittsburgh and Cleveland. And halfway between Pittsburgh and Cleveland, and also close to halfway between the lake and the river. So it made it an ideal point, and all the roads, main, north, south, and east-west roads went through Salem. So Street was Zadok Street's third oldest son. Zadok Street and John Strong were both wealthy merchants from New Jersey and Connecticut, respectively. Street was a jeweler, had quite a bit of wealth before he moved, and he was quite old when he moved to Salem. So his sons were already grown, some of them married with families. Aaron, his second oldest son, came and went. Came to Salem, stayed a while, went further west. Came back to Salem for a while, went further west. He was kind of the vagabond. John, though, the third oldest son, stayed. His oldest son did not come. His oldest son stayed behind in New Jersey. So Zadok died within a short period of time of moving to Salem. And again, he was already old. But John kind of took over his place as the town elder. He became the first mayor. And this was the third house he lived in. And he built this house specifically to harbor slaves as well. Obviously, he was well-to-do. You can tell from the size and scope of the house. It has, if you look at the front of the house, left-hand side was the library, his office. And there is a stairwell, I'll show you in a second, that is to the left of that central entry hall. And you know the big triangular shape under the stairwell? Well, they built a closet right next to it, and those two spaces together were big enough to put a bed and table and chairs for a secret room. He also has, to the right-hand side would be the parlor, and just beyond it, behind it, would be the dining room. And between the parlor and the dining room is a china closet built into the wall. However, the upper china cupboard, which has the glass doors on it, and you'd show your wares there, and the bottom has closed doors, like most china cupboards. But unlike most china cupboards, the bottom door has a trap door in the floor, and you crawl through the china closet into the floor to the secret room in the basement. There was a tunnel leaving this home and proceeding north to the house next door. I'll show you. This is the top picture, is the view from inside the house looking out that door, so you can see that stairwell there. So they built the closet just beyond that to make that room. This is a picture from their parlor, and the top right-hand picture is the china closet. And that is still open today and goes into the room in the basement. And that was the only way to get into that room. So the slaves that came to Salem, they walked, they took wagons, horseback, train. They even went across the river. Now, people didn't know how to swim back then, so getting across the river was a little bit dicey, hard for them. But there were certain points, especially along the Ohio River, where people could traverse more easily. Portsmouth was one of those locations, because there were several conductors at Portsmouth that would actually ferry you across the river in a boat. But the other thing is, unlike today, you know, when we think of the Ohio River, big, full, lots of water, there were times when the Ohio River was more like a creek, because they didn't have the locks and dam systems that they have today to keep the water flowing all the time. So there were certain times that you could get across the river a little bit more easily. They came the earliest documented dates are 1825. So by 1825, there were people coming through our area to escape. They came in daylight, nighttime. They came in winter, summer, fall, spring. Obviously, parts of the year were easier. Winter was the hardest, not just for the weather, but because they could see the best. When the foliage is off the trees, they can see you much more easily. So this is just some pictures of them coming and the kind of modes of transportation they used. That middle picture is a little buck wagon, and it has a secret compartment in it. So you could go in the secret compartment, and then they would pile fruits, vegetables, whatever they're transporting on top of that. They're the Bonsall family, which lived, I don't know, for those of you who've been in the area for a long time, you may remember there was a white building across from the hospital in Salem, and for a good period of time it housed the Hannah Mullen School of Nursing, and it had the tower on it. If you remember that building, that was actually the Bonsall farmstead. That was one of those other land grants in Salem. And when Bonsall's daughter, one of his kids, was 7 years old, she took this buck wagon back and forth between Salem and Lisbon to transport slaves. Now you're thinking, a 7-year-old driving a wagon? Well, remember, we're talking 1800s. We're talking farmers. That would have not been an unusual sight to see a child driving a wagon from one place to another. It also meant that they were less likely to interrogate her, and it was a lot harder to find people who were hiding. I am glad to tell you that there are no reports of any of the people in Salem being prosecuted for their anti-slavery activities, nor of any slaves being captured in Salem. That's just a testament to how many people were involved and how strong the network was there. This is a map, a local map, that's a blow-up of a section of the Siebert map made in 1895. Now, nobody kept records. You know, you couldn't keep any written records because someone could find them and go after you or capture slaves. But after the time of abolition in the Underground Railroad, Siebert, who was a historian, went back and interviewed people who were still alive, who had been involved at the time, and recreated some documents like this map. So he has a map of all the Underground Railroad routes in the country. And this is a blow-up of our area. The red dot is Salem. Now, they asked me what I knew about Petersburg and its involvement. And I know a couple folks here have said when they knocked on the inn, they discovered some tunnels. But I can't find anything in writing. And I went back, because I have a couple sources. It's not to say that it's not there. But again, people didn't write it down in the time, and if someone didn't document it later and give us some more info, we can't really point to that. But you can see that there are red lines that go north, south, and east and west. And I will tell you a couple things about this area and what else was happening. If you were escaping and you made it and you were in Pennsylvania, you probably would never have interacted with us. And you guys are right on the border. Like, we're close, but you're right on the border. Darlington was a hotbed of activity for abolition, as was New Brighton. New Brighton had a large community of Quakers that lived there, and they had a very extensive network that provided a good north-south route. So you would follow the river, the Beaver River, and you would go north. So if you go out to that part of the world, you wouldn't even come over into Ohio. You would have just kept going north and gone up. But if it wasn't safe there, you know, if there was one of the diversions that you needed to make, you would probably cross over into Ohio, because there were many communities in Ohio that would help you to go north. You'd go into Ohio, and then you'd go north generally as soon as you could. So you might get to Salem and take that main north route, which is State Route 45, because that was already a road at the time, and you'd go north and south. So you could see from Salem, we've got lots of routes coming and going from there. Our best route, whenever we could take it, would be go straight north towards Warren, because Warren had another community of staunch abolitionists that were very supportive. And then you could go up towards Ashtabula, and you'd cut up towards New York. So the most common route of people leaving our area was to go north towards Ashtabula, head a little bit east, and go up towards Buffalo to get into Canada. However, if you had made it as far as us and it wasn't safe to go north, we might send you west, and you would go to Damascus, and you might end up going up towards the Cleveland route. And those people who went as far as Cleveland, as far west as Cleveland, would continue west and go towards the Detroit route. up towards Canada. Now, you could go in any direction, but those were the more common of the routes. So you could see that there's some roads that kind of connect east and west so that you could go to one of those main points, and then, but ultimately, your goal was to keep going north and to get up to Canada. So, going into the country in Salem, and now you think, oh, what's the country in Salem? Well, that's around 10th Street, okay? So 10th Street would have been the country. Because you would have been, and if you're in the trolley, like when we show you this in the trolley, you get a feeling for how much further away that is than it sounds like. It's only 10 blocks north, but it's really pretty far when you have to go. And Salem blocks are tiny. We're not talking Youngstown blocks. We're talking Petersburg blocks, so we're tiny blocks. So when you go to the country, one of those farms that met at the center of town, those original land grants, the house is at 999 Jennings. So not only is it 10 blocks north, it's like 6 or 7 blocks west to get to the house for that. And this is the house. This is the Jonas and Enoch Cattell house. One of the oldest still standing houses in Salem. The red part, the dark part, is 1803. The light part is 1811. Now you'll see on the house plaque, and that gray part in the back, that's an add-on that's not significant to the Underground Railroad, but it has 3 parts. The plaque says 1811 because when they first issued the plaques in 1976, they didn't realize that that other part of the house was actually 1803, which it is. And you see the front of the house there. The Cattells died and left their young child, their son, to the care of friends in Damascus. Those friends raised him. When he became of age, he moved back to the house. Now, staunch abolitionist, he owned that dark red brick part because they left the house for him until he was of age. They rented it out until then. So when he got back to the house, he wanted to do more. So instead of changing the house that he added the 1811 part on. And that was designed specifically to harbor slaves. So in the 1811 part, he has a cupboard on the second floor, which is 2 cupboards back to back. You go in the first cupboard, open the door, hang up your clothes. In the back of the cupboard's a door. And you open that door, there's room for 6 people to hide in the back of the cupboard, in another cupboard that you can't see. Had some hiding places in the downstairs area of the house, had a barn in the back that was used for hiding slaves, and dug a channel over half a mile long going north. There's a channel, a dug channel from this house north, planted all around the channel. So it's kind of like an arbor in effect. And for 3/4 of the year, you can take that channel over half a mile north and not be discovered above ground. Because you're just walking lower and only part of your body's, don't go in there, it's full of poison ivy. Okay? We wanted to take people on a walk and they're looking like, no, we can't take people on a walk in there. But it's still there. And if you do like drone pictures, then you can see that channel still runs from this house north. So here's some pictures inside. You can see the cupboard I was telling you about. You can also see up into the attic. So all the traditional, like normal hiding places, like go into your attic, go into your basement, go here, go there. People also hid people in beds. Rope beds were the popular bed of the day, so there were ropes that held the mattress up. They were feather tick mattresses, or they were tick mattresses that you actually grabbed stuff from your barnyard and stuffed it with it. So they were really lumpy. And you would pick that mattress up, the person would lay face down on the ropes, throw the mattress back on top of them. They could stay there for a long time and no one would find them. So it wasn't just people of means who could build secret rooms and hiding places that were involved in the Underground Railroad. This shows the current owner. There was a trap door in the kitchen that led to one of the tunnels in the basement, a secret hiding spot, and this is one of their fireplaces. So why did the slaves come here? Well, they came because our Constitution didn't allow slavery. Well, that was why the Quakers came, and that it was Indian free. That's kind of a misnomer, I'll tell you in a sec. Why did the slaves choose us? For the same reason, and plus we were close to Canada. So just a little bit more on the Quakers, because that's really important to understand why so many people in Salem were involved in abolition. 1652, George Fox started the Quakers in England. How did they get the name Quakers? Well, I already told you their real name is Society of Friends. He was in court, and he said to the magistrate, we all of us should quake in the presence of the Lord. Now, y'all know there's a religion called Shakers, right? Shakers shake. Quakers don't shake. Quake means reverence. Quake means to be reverent. So when George Fox told the magistrate you should quake in the presence of the Lord, it was just to honor God. But the newspapers, just like today, took up with that name and publicized it and called them Quakers. So it was originally derogatory. Now it's not derogatory, it's what they're commonly known as, but they are technically the Society of Friends. 5 basic tenets. Personal relationship with the divine. No ministers, no order of worship, no singing, no praying out loud together, no sermons, okay? You go to a meeting house where you meet to commune together and pray individually, okay? We still have one Quaker meeting house in Salem. That's basically the Orthodox version of being a Quaker. Today we also have Quaker churches. Quaker churches are similar to any Christian church that you might be familiar with. You know, Catholic or Protestant. They have ministers, youth ministers, the choir directors, they have an order of worship. They have the things that are very common to other Americans through their church services. But we still have meeting houses that are in the traditional way. 10:30, first day, which is Sunday. If you want to do that, I'll show you their meeting house in just a sec. But personal divine relationship with the divine, living an outward life that is a testament to your beliefs. So it's not enough to believe. You have to do something about what you believe. Everyone is equal. That means men, women, black, white, children, adults. Now think 1800, 1850, that's a pretty radical idea. Some people would think that's a radical idea today. So everyone is equal. We are always peaceful. No fighting. Now, think about the Civil War and how that comes into play. That's really why there's an explosion of different religions after the Civil War in Salem. Because until that point, everyone was Quaker. But those men who took up arms in the war could no longer be Quaker because they were no longer peaceful. They were religious. They believed in God. They had to find an outlet for that, and that's when all the other religions come into Salem. You'll see that in the congregations. That 1860s period is when we have the Baptists, the Lutherans, the Episcopalians. The Catholics came then too, but not for the same reason. They came for the railroad and the steel mill, because most of the Italians and Irish that came over in that time period were Catholic, and so that's when the Catholic Church came as well, but not related to slavery. The last thing is always tell the truth. I mentioned that already. Quakers will not lie to save their own life. So that's the 5 things they believe in, which is why so many people in Salem were abolitionists, because of those basic beliefs that they believe in and had to show. This is the Wilbur Friends Meeting House. It's not actually part of the Underground Railroad because it's 1872. And they have the left side, they had a left side for women, a right side for men. They were separate but equal. Okay, they were equal, but they had different roles and responsibilities in the community. The bottom picture shows the right side today because they turned the left side into a meeting room and a kitchen and a social hall, but they still have a left and a right on the right side. And imagine 1872, this building is new, and in the front you have wagons tied up, and in the back there's like a lean-to barn for another 25 or 30 wagons. And it's Sunday, and it's full of wagons. All the windows are open. It's summer, so those big white window shutters are open. And not a sound is coming from that building. A Wyandotte Indian chief, and the Wyandottes were the last Indian tribe to inhabit Salem. There were 3 different tribes. The Wyandottes were there from 1800 on at least. And remember how I told you, they'll tell you Ohio was Indian free after 1800 when they signed the last Indian treaty? No. But the Indians and the Quakers coexisted. They figured there's enough food and land for everyone. We don't have to fight. You come on through. We don't care. Well, the Wyandotte Indian chief came through, looked in the window, and there's all these people. And again, not a sound, because they're worshiping on Sunday. So they invited him in. He shared service. They shared food together. No, it wasn't Thanksgiving dinner, but it was food. But that happened after 1872. So I can tell you for sure, there were still Indians in Salem after 1872, because this building wasn't there till then. And that's reported in the local history records of that time. So it's not something they made up later. One of the cemeteries, we have a couple really old cemeteries in Salem. Our earliest cemetery was actually demolished. It was where the Goodwill used to be on Broadway. That was a friend's burial ground that was relocated. There is still a burial ground on Ellsworth. We have two large cemeteries still existing, as well as the friend's burial ground. But Hope is the one that's on North Lincoln. So when you're coming into town from 62, and you come down there, 62 and 9. And buried there is Edmund Koppak. Now it's like, okay, Edmund Koppak. Remember the house of John Street, the one with the china closet that you crawled into? He had a friend. His friend's name was John Brown. Anybody know the name John Brown? John Brown's Body, John Brown's Raid on Harper's Ferry. John Brown's idea was to steal all the guns and ammunition at the arsenal, the army arsenal, and give it to the slaves so they could fight for themselves. Well, here's the thing. John Brown used to be a Quaker. He lived in Akron. He was very active in the Quaker church until he advocated violence, fighting, no longer peaceful. They kicked him out. Quakers did that. You know, if you don't follow the rules, you get kicked out. But John was still friends with a lot of Quakers, including all the Streets. He and Street were friends. Whenever he was in Salem, he stayed at Street's house, the house with the china closet. And he also recruited young idealistic people, some of them Quakers. Edwin and Barclay Koppak lived in New Garden, Winona. That's where they lived, just south of Salem. And they were living in Indiana because they had moved west. And Brown recruited them. And they accompanied him on the Harper's Ferry raid. Edwin Koppak, the older brother, was captured during the raid. He didn't die. Barclay wasn't captured. Barclay was out with the wagons waiting to pick him up and take him off after they were successful. But they weren't successful, and everyone who wasn't killed at Harper's Ferry was captured. And all those people were tried for treason and executed, including Edwin Koppak. Now, they had to bury him somewhere, and his closest family lived in Winona, so they brought him back to Winona to bury him. And that was Christmas week, 1859. And the people of Salem said, hey, we really would like to move Edwin Koppak to Salem and give him a hero's burial and make sure no one steals his body. Now, why would you do that? Well, if you stole a body, there was no proof that they died for the cause of abolition. And that's what they were afraid they'd do. They were afraid they were going to dig him up and steal his body, not because he was valuable any other way. So his family agreed, and now remember, this is 1859. 2,000 people marched with his body from Winona to Salem to rebury him at Hope Cemetery. So this obelisk is there. Now, usually they bury people 6 feet under. He's buried 12 feet under. 3 200-pound rocks, and then this mud and straw mixture that turns as hard as concrete. So he has 12 feet of rock on top of him so that they wouldn't dig him up. Now, there are people who will tell you he's not actually there. I can't say one way or the other. But anyway, that raid, the raid on Harper's Ferry, was one of the precipitating factors of the Civil War. Really brought things to a head. This is Maurice and Emily Robinson's house, North Lincoln. Maurice was a student and then a professor at the seminary in Cincinnati, which was the site of training for abolitionists. Emily raked straw, lived in New Garden. She went to the seminary to be educated. Now, the seminary was like college. Okay, so she was a Quaker. Quaker women were allowed to go to school because they're equal. They went to a secondary finishing school in Salem, like a high school, and then they could go to the seminary, which was like college. So she left New Garden and went to Cincinnati in the 1820s to go to college. Met Maurice Robinson, fell in love. They were passionate about the same things, wanted to get married. You can imagine her family was not real fond of that idea, but they did marry. They came back to Salem in 1830, where Maurice became the editor of the Anti-Slavery Bugle newspaper, and they lived in this house. Maurice gave a speech in Berlin Center. He was a very, very convincing lecturer. The Butternuts captured him, tarred and feathered him, put him in a wagon, dumped him in a farmer's field in Canfield to die, because they were sure he was going to die. Because usually you did die when you were tarred and feathered. You either died of the burns or the infection. But the farmer and his wife nursed him back to health, And he was able to come back to his home and his family, his wife and his children, until they threatened to tar and feather his wife. Then he sold the house to the neighbors for $1 and they moved, did not return to the abolition movement. They became farmers, lived in the area. They are buried here. But this is a copy of the Bugle. Our museum has reproductions available. We have the entire set if you need to do research. This is a picture not of Morius, but of someone who was tarred and feathered. I don't have a picture of Morius' scars for being tarred and feathered. And this is what downtown Salem looked like in 1850. And this is if you are at the corner of Lincoln and State, looking west. So that big building with all the smoke coming out of it was a woolen mill. That's where Harry Hoffmeister Realty is today. So if you're at that corner looking west, Jacob Heaton's house would have been on the right-hand side, about 2 blocks up, but you could see homes, businesses all along the street. This house is on South Lincoln. It was Israel Gaskell's house. It didn't look like this when it was built. It looked like this. So they added the windows, the towers. It was a wood building. They bricked it. It was actually the 3rd house he lived in there. He came to Salem in 1805 in his wagon, lived in the wagon first, then he built a log cabin, and then he built this home, 1820. It was eventually re-bricked and revised to see what you saw. And on the bottom there, bottom left-hand side, that's a tunnel. The tunnel is still there. It was only bricked up 2 years ago. The current owner was having a problem with rodents coming in through the tunnel. And so, but what he did is he bricked it up back, like not at the very end of the tunnel. He left the first part of the tunnel so you could actually see where it was. And he has a grate in his kitchen. And the tunnel's lit from below, so you can stand in the kitchen and look through the grate to see the tunnel that was there. Now this tunnel led to a house that was next door, and again, this is one of the oldest remaining houses, and he too was one of those original farms that gave 2 acres to the town. He only had a 320-acre farm though, but it was all of South Lincoln Avenue. And you know, that's the place where all the big fancy pretty houses are today. Well, that was all his farm. And his house is actually at the beginning of that street. This is a house that's at the end of the corner. It was Zadok Street, not the original town founder, but the son of John with the china closet. This named after his grandfather, the town founder. He and his wife Sybil lived in this house. There's a Sybil building on Broadway. He built it, named it after his wife. She was a very well-known preacher. They were Quakers, but she was a preacher as well. Not a pastor in the Quaker faith, but a preacher. They lived at this corner. They had 11 children. And they lived at this corner until the Gaskells died, and then they moved down to the Gaskell house that you just saw. And the 3rd floor of that house was a dormitory. It was the boys' dormitory. All the sons were on the 3rd floor, and then the girls had bedrooms on the 2nd floor, along with the parents. And it's a fairly large house with a lot of bedrooms in it. I think it has 5 or 6 bedrooms. And that family sold it to the Snyders. And I don't know, some of you may know Nina Whistler, because she's really involved in a lot of community organizations. Nina's 90 now, and Nina is a descendant of that family and grew up in that house. So it's wonderful because she can still tell original stories from the Gaskell house. This is the Calvin Moore house. It's about a block to the south. It was originally a home, then it became the Quaker School for Girls. It was the secondary school, like the high school for girls. So after you went to the Quaker one-room schoolhouse Quaker, you would go here to the secondary school for girls. Around 1900, someone came to the owners that were living at the house at the time and said, "Hey, do you know about the secret room in your house?" And it was like, we didn't know anything about this stuff then. So they showed them, they had taken, the ceilings are real high, 12, 14 feet high on the first floors of most of the houses on South Lincoln. So they had taken 2 feet from the first floor, and they had taken 2 feet from the bedroom above it, on the floor end, and made a 4-foot tall room that's 10 by 10. And this diagram shows you a picture of that. So because they raised the bedroom on the 2nd floor, they had to put in steps to get up to that level. You picked those steps up, and you'd walk through there to get to the secret room that was between the floors. You can see, like, you think 4 feet's not very big. Well, you know what? You could sit on the floor and sit up tall. You could sit on a bench and hunch over. It was spacious for someone trying to escape who had to stay for any length of time. When they discovered that room, there were still chicken bones on the bench. And they went to pick up the chicken bones and they turned to dust because they had been there for over 50 years. And no one knew that room was in the house. So Calvin Moore House definitely had a spot. This is the Benjamin and Elizabeth Jones house. Now, I mentioned them previously. They were emissaries from William Lloyd Garrison. They were sent from Boston along with Abby Kelly to start the anti-slavery newspaper, The Bugle, in our area, Columbian County. First 6 issues were in Lisbon, then it moved to Salem, where it published for the rest of its years. They were Benjamin and Elizabeth. It was Elizabeth Hitchcock. They weren't married when they moved here. They got married within the first 6 months and stayed for 4 years. They were the first co-editors of the Bugle. She carried the bricks to build this house 8 blocks up South Lincoln from where Riley Stadium is today, because there was the Pigeon Brickyard was there then. And so I always tell people she's mentally, physically, and morally strong. She ran an anti-slavery bookstore downtown. In 1859, she wrote a book called The Young Abolitionist, which you can read online. And they stayed here for 4 years, editing the Bugle, and she talking, lecturing in the area, until they threatened to tar and feather Benjamin. Sold their house to the neighbors for $1 and left town. Now, they did stay in Ohio, and they eventually returned to Salem, and he was the final editor of the anti-slavery Bugle as well. 2 more houses, then. So this is Joel McMillan's house, closest house to the railroad in Salem. Sits on a rise surrounded by a ravine. The ravine is filled with trees and brush, so it made it a very good hiding place around the house. It also made it a very good stopping place for someone trying to storm your house and come in. The home is not visible most seasons of the year. You can only see it in the winter because it's very wooded there. Some of you may be familiar with the name McMillan because we have the McMillan bookstore, the McMillan store, office supply store. That's the same store. Been in Salem for over 150 years. And this is his home. Now he was the closest house to the railroad. He had in the basement, there's a hiding spot behind the kitchen. You took bricks out from the side and you could go behind there. And there was a barn back there as well. This is that fireplace in the basement. Now you can't see where you took the things off because the mantle and some of the other pieces are gone. But you can see these big arched areas, and there was panels in front of them, so you could pull the panel up and go back in. It just looked like your thing was paneled, so lots of hiding spaces there. In 1854, they called it the Angry Mob. 200 Salemites, now remember they're all Quakers, so they really were not going to fight. But 200 people approached a train. There was a husband and wife traveling from Baltimore on the train in Salem, and they had a young black slave attending them. And they demanded that they release her and free her. And since the odds were 200 to 2, they did. She left the train with them. They took her to the McMillan house you just saw. They named her Abby Kelly Salem, after Abby Kelly in our town. And she became a domestic and worked in Salem for the rest of her days. He was also partners in a couple ventures with Daniel Hauheis. The last and most famous house in Salem that we always take people to is Unserheim, which means our home in German. And a lot of the Salem Quakers had a German background. Saxon, we have a Saxon club and a German background. This is a picture of what the house looks like today. Originally, it was a very modest, one-peaked farmhouse, so it was 1/3 the size of this house. It was built by Aaron Heiss, who was Daniel's father. Daniel married Margaret and moved to another home in Salem. He had several homes in Salem before he moved back to the family farm. He tripled the size of the house, added 66 windows and 7 doors. If you look at this home, there is nothing symmetrical anywhere. So the peaks, everything is a different size and shape. It's built like a fun house at an amusement park. You can go inside, you don't know where you are if you're inside from the outside. And he did that specifically to harbor people. This is an old drawing of the house when it still had the 3 peaks. There are He kept a diary called Pap's Diary or the Journal of Daniel Hall Heiss. We transcribe that. You can see it online. It's on the Salem Public Library. If you're doing Quaker research or abolition research, punch in names, it's searchable. But again, it's coded. So there's nothing in there that specifically tells you certain things. You have to read between the lines to figure out what he was talking about. There is a trapdoor in the attic that you can get out onto the roof. There were 2 tunnels. One went from the house to the carriage house, one went from the house to the barn. The barn also had a ramp at the front of it because it wasn't on ground level, and there was a hiding room under that ramp. They have several parlors in the house because there's like 3 parlors since they expanded the house. 2 of them have trap doors that you can get into hidden rooms underground. There is, there's on the side of the house, you can see that porch and it's on raised pillars to the left there. There's a wall there, like in that last section of the house to the right. And it looks like this. This is the window, okay, where the fellow is standing. He's one of the current occupants of the house, owners of the house. There's 2 windows, and they're like 2 feet apart, 3 feet apart. And the one window, the inside window is kind of frosted. The outside window is clear, so when it's daylight, it looks like daylight. When it's raining, you can hear it and see it. But you're actually looking through a window to another window. And there is a passageway there, all along that wall. And when you open this window, and you actually climb into there to go along the passageway. But the passageway has no floor. There is, when you go, you open the window, you pull the floor out as you go to walk on it, and the last person pushes the floor back in. So when you open that window, it just looks like construction. At the end of that passage is a room that can hold 20 people. So this house has the most spots. He was actually the main coordinator of all the activities for the Underground Railroad in the area. If you look at any of the books of the day, you'll find him mentioned. So the Civil War cost more than $10 billion. Lots of people died. Antietam, 26,000 people in a day. Gettysburg, 50,000 people in 4 days. 2% of the population of the country died. Now, I know everyone in our area has a GAR post, okay? So think about people. Our GAR post in Salem, we had 3,600 people that lived in Salem at the time of the Civil War. 600 were in the GAR post. 600 people from Salem, 1 in every 6 men, women, and children served in the Civil War. So obviously the character of our town religiously and politically changed after the Civil War. And it was the same for many of the communities in our area. And while slavery might have been abolished in 1865, we know it didn't solve all our problems. As people always say, well, we still have some of those problems today. And you have been a wonderful audience. And I invite you to visit us anytime. We're open by appointment. We're also open until the end of October every Sunday afternoon. And I have 2 things for you today. I have a little booklet that has some of the Underground Railroad homes and descriptions in them for you if you would like to take them home. And also info on a program that we have coming up, an evening with Mark Twain on the 24th. And I'd be happy to stay for questions, because I know some people have to go.